Hi, welcome to the 17th episode of Startup Strides. Today, my guest is Andrew Kuzemczak. Welcome, Andrew. Very nice to have you on.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Andrew, you have I don't have a better word to describe your educational background. Very impressive. You went to Yale, you studied biology there, and you decided to go to Columbia to study biomedical engineering. And actually, you're heading to med school soon, too. Besides your educational background, obviously, you have a very impressive professional, experiences as well. We're going to delve more into that as we speak more. But I'm just curious, starting from the very background, why you decided to pursue like those degrees and, how each of these institutions has shaped your career so far.
Sure. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. So we'll begin from the beginning.
Mhm.
Going to Yale was really, as any high school applicant experience, was really just a deal of applying and seeing where the best school ended up being. And that ended up being in New Haven. And so we arrived there. I got to Yale as a traditional pre-med with the idea of being undergrad for 4 years, right to med school, and then practicing as a physician for the remainder of my life. What I found was at Yale and how it transformed my path was in my second year there. I was brought onto or invited to join this health tech biotech club that a friend of mine started. And that allowed me to meet countless physicians who all had the same report, which was they loved their work. Working with patients was great, but they had tons of ideas and with issues in healthcare that they wanted to solve, but lacked the skills to actually develop out those ideas. And that brainstorm made me brainstorm how my future could be just slightly different, still as a physician, but perhaps more in the tech and engineering space, practicing, but then transitioning into entrepreneurship, building ideally my own company, which is now the long-term plan. So that club, which is called Helix, ended up developing into an incubator. We brought on about 10 doctors the year that I took over as director, launched 5 companies, and it was one of the greatest experiences I could have had in my 4 years, just because I was excited every day learning something new. And it really showed me that entrepreneurship was the long-term goal for me, not necessarily just clinical practice every day. And then we get to Columbia. The reason that came about was because I, through Helix, was able to start 2 startups and lead that incubator. And I found that as a biology major, I didn't speak the language of my engineering co-founders, didn't have the technical expertise to build out the companies. So I knew a master's wasn't going to make me, some incredible engineer, but I at least could learn the basics and speak the same language. So I went to Columbia, and then now we go to med school, and it was specifically chosen Cornell in New York City with its entrepreneurial resources, the city with all the financing and venture capital. So we'll be there starting in August.
That's so cool. Really, no other way to explain. But so another thing I'm curious. By the way, if I look to the side, it's because I'm looking at the questions. I'm fully paying attention to you.
Sure.
You had I was a biochemistry major, and it was so hard, like going through the college, balancing education with other activities and responsibilities. But you managed to, on top of that, your really hard educational, kind of path, be involved in entrepreneurship, start companies. How you manage to like balance founding startups and your academic responsibilities and other stuff?
Sure. So I discovered ending high school, going into college, that the ideal life that I want to live is not one where I'm perfectly well rounded in every category of life, but really develop a passion, and everything else outside of that, I simplify as much as possible. So I guess the
Mm.
tip here would be simplify everything you possibly can. So in my life, I save a ton of time by making sure I don't try to spread myself too thin. I do a lot of things focused in health tech, medicine, and entrepreneurship, but everything from my like daily exercise routine, nutrition, everything else around that, I try to really hone down to the basics so that I could save time, and with that saved time, dedicate myself to what I want to do in life. So college was a lot of that. I knew that, it's valuable to have extracurriculars to go to med school, but I
Mhm.
wasn't going to have 10 of them. I was going to do 3 to 4, which was ended up being the number. I was going to try to be the leader of each of them, the best I could be, get published in the lab, whatever it is. Just be the best, but
Mhm.
don't try to do 10 different things and be 50% in each. Do
Mhm.
3 to 4 and give your 100% as much as you can to those few things. So I would say simplifying every aspect of my life outside of my passion and dedicating myself to what was left
Mhm.
was a big tip. And then lastly, my time management is all based on time blocking. Since the beginning of college, I would spend the last 5 minutes of every evening before bed, setting out all the things I had to do the next day, and then slapping them together into related time blocks. Let's say like responding to all emails, administrative tasks, studying, and then setting up my schedule the next day based on that, so that when the day arrived, there was never guessing what I had to do next when I walked out of a lecture. I just check my phone, look at my time block, it tells me what I have to do, and I get right to it. So that's how I was relatively efficient in college, and I'm going to use it again in med school. Right now, I'm relaxed. It's the summertime, but in med school, I'll be right back to it. I know that.
Yo, and that's I really admire people like you who are like super disciplined and they stick to their like schedule and discipline. It's impressive. You went to you obviously you said you wanted to become like more proficient in technical stuff. That's why you kind of pursued biomedical engineering degree. Besides the technical expertise that you gained throughout your time there, how did your time at Columbia really shape your? Did it change it in any way? Did you learn something new? What was the outcome of that experience?
So, like I said, going to Columbia was in part to be able to speak that same engineering language, but it was also, I guess, 2 years to validate if I really wanted to do the entrepreneurial path. Because it could
Mm.
also show me meeting a lot of entrepreneurs while at Columbia. Is this really what I want? Did Yale kind of give me a rose colored view of the future? Perhaps Columbia will convince me otherwise. So, my classes there and the work I did was largely engineering based, obviously, but I also had the opportunity to take intellectual property protection law classes, project management classes. And what I found was not just the engineering excited me, but everything about leadership of small teams and the different things that I had to consider as a founder were so incredibly exciting to have like a new and exciting day every single day when you wake up. Meaning, as a founder, you're not going to be the perfect lawyer in IP law. You're not going to be the perfect engineer, perfect business person, perfect accountant, but you should try to be as good as possible in those things to succeed and move the company forward. So Columbia gave me the opportunity not just to pigeonhole into engineering, although that was probably 80%, 90% of my work. I was able to sit down with a ton of business professionals or professors and take classes in the area, showing me that absolutely entrepreneurship is the ideal path. And every part of the founder role, even when it's most stressful and you're most bogged down, I thought was so cool. So I knew that it was validation for what I want to do.
That's really cool. So after that, you pursued, if I'm not mistaken, consulting work
Yep.
experience, right? You worked at Ambit, and how did that kind of help you formulate your knowledge and kind of like the opinion on the business side of the biotech and the medtech development?
So choosing Ambit, specifically consulting, was kind of a very productive filler of the year that I was applying to med
Mm.
school. Didn't want to just sit around and kind of write essays and whatnot. So I applied, and Ambit was the final decision on my end because it was itself a startup. It is a consulting firm, which automatically people will discount as not a startup because it's a service-oriented business. But it was only started in 2021. So when I was recruited on, I was pitched by the founders that you will be able to see us lead in the good times, the bad times, see what is valuable for you as a future founder. And that is exactly what I got. I was able to sit and see Ambit at its best times when we were super cash flow positive, and at times when we were a little bit in a cash crunch. I could see them hire and fire with different paces, different tendencies, and how they do mid-year reviews. So as a ideal future founder, was able to sit in a consulting firm but have direct access to the CEO, the CCO, whoever else, to see how businesses run in the good times and the bad. More specifically to medicine, though, we did a lot of pharma and biotech consulting. What that taught me was perhaps that the world of innovation in medicine is not just, unfortunately, the purest of science and with the patients in mind. It is a lot of business, marketing, and truth stretching, let's call it, to make you sound like your product is the best. Your, new drug for a rare disease might be almost identical to your competitors, but if you market it in a certain way, you could convince people otherwise. And that was a negative but productive takeaway that I had and an insight from working with these clients and what they were asking us to do. It showed me that for my long-term plan, pharma is not necessarily what I want to do. It pushed me a bit more towards innovation with hardware and software, where you can quantify whether your product is working or not working rather simply, right? If you build a pump for a heart, you know through pure physics if the flow is improving. If you build software, you know if the product is giving you the output you want. Whereas if you innovate a bit in pharma or in part in biotech, there's a lot of kind of stretching and moving things around to present it in the best way. And I learned through Ambit that it wasn't as satisfying for me. And so that is not most likely not what I'm going to end up in.
I see. I see. And just to rewind back a bit, right? Like in college, you said you started two medtech startups. So what were they, what problems you were trying to solve and how the ideas even came to you, especially being in college. It's so interesting that you can come up with such a new idea while being an undergrad student.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to make sure that I don't stretch any truth, right? I was 18 and 19 years old at this time. So I did not suddenly like wake up and think we're
Mm.
going to make for one of the companies it was a retinal imager that could provide you cardiac condition details telling you whether you have high blood pressure, diabetes risk, whatever. I was not 18 years old thinking of these things. I had the ability to build them alongside both companies, which I'll talk about, physicians and business professionals at Yale because of the Helix Club that I was a part of. These doctors would come in, and when I was not the director, but just one of the members of the club, they'd come in and say, we have this problem for the retinal imager. We know that the eye is the only spot in the body where you can directly see blood vessels and nerves. We think we could do something with that. What are your thoughts? And so as a team, our engineering team, our undergrad team would work with the doctor, and we co-founded what ended up becoming Binocular Health, building out an early stage machine learning algorithm that was trained on thousands upon thousands of retinal images, saying which ones are indicative of high blood pressure, whether you can measure pulse through that, whether you could tell a blood sugar level from that. So that is how the idea came about. It is not just me brainstorming. It was a team effort, started from a doctor telling us his issue. And then the second one was Luminous. That was a chief resident at Yale New Haven Hospital coming to us saying, the supply room in the hospital, when I go in and have to grab my equipment, is an absolute mess. We don't know how to bill for certain things. I can't find things. I'm delayed running around. Can we make this tech-enabled more efficient? So we built Luminous, which was a smart supply room, building an app that allows doctors, nurses, physicians, assistants to select everything they need on their iPhone while heading off to the room. And when they walk in, their assigned color is illuminated on the shelves for them to grab what they need. It creates a little cart that they can then swipe up and bill to that direct patient. So everything is tracked. The supply chain is consistent, so people know what needs to be restocked. And that again was brought up to, was developed because the resident came to us with his issue.
It's so interesting. So what I'm noticing is there's a pattern, right? It's either somebody who's been in the field for a while and just like through the intuition saying there's a problem that can be solved, or you get really annoyed at something and then through that, annoyance, you're like, okay, maybe there can be some technologies that can fix that, right? Uh, you've been in the field and you kind of experience that a lot. What do you think? What's the like a natural kind of like development for medtech companies? Is that the formula they follow, or is there some other elements to that too?
Yeah, I would say, again, I'm still in a very early stage in my career and wanting, very much moving forward to the entrepreneurial path. But for what it's worth, I would say the most exciting companies that I find
Mm.
are often from somebody's personal experience with an inconvenience at the minimum, which is like a supply room bothers me, all the way to a personal experience with god awful results like the experience I got in cancer treatment was horrible. I want to improve it. All of those provide really intense personal motivation to come up with a solution and then building a team of engineers or what you need around you to push it forward. I rarely find somebody who's kind of tangential to healthcare just suddenly thinks like it'd be really important for us to improve supply rooms in emergency rooms or whatever.
Mm.
It's often from a personal connection.
Mm. I see. I see. And through your personal experiences and research, and what are the main challenges founders face when launching and growing medtech startups, right? And what's the best way to navigate them? By the way, before you also kind of like talk about that, I'm curious because like usually when you talk about biotech companies, it's such a lengthy process. There's FDA approvals, it takes like average 10 to 15 years to bring a drug to the market. There's just like so many elements as you already briefly touched upon that. How is medtech development differs from, the biotech kind of development?
Totally. So medtech, specifically hardware, software, is rather interesting because there's a lot of regulatory clauses that say if you can prove your hardware is similar enough to a previous one, but innovative in certain directions, you get an accelerated path to approval. It's a very interesting part that a lot of orthopedic, or rather surgical device companies utilize, like Stryker or Arthrex. They say that this new hip, chromium hip, is similar enough to a previous one that you've already approved. So our path should be accelerated and we'll show you how it's just slightly better. So the path in medtech, when I say medtech, I mean hardware, specifically sometimes software, is an accelerated path as compared to biotech and pharma, where, like you said, it's about a decade on average to get something to market. That is certainly a very tangible difference in timeline.
I see. And, building, you've been on the founder side, you've been on the consulting side of things, you've been on, like the business development side of things. What are the main challenges founders face when they're building a medtech, and how they should approach navigating? I mean, your personal opinion.
So, like healthcare inertia is probably the worst thing you're going to face, meaning the industry is massive, $4 trillion. It's ripe for disruption, but nobody wants to move. That is just how it works. Regulations, the fear of harming patients, the fear of innovating so much that you break something prevents health systems from moving in any sort of like tactical manner or rapid manner. So you as a founder have to kind of grind your gears and work for extended periods of time to make some significant change. Any tips that I could offer at my early stage is finding 1 to 2 kind of core mentors at an early stage. It's probably one of the most important things I've found in both of my previous startups. When you are, let's say you're a doctor in a hospital and you have access, that's terrific. But oftentimes you're not a founder directly in the hospital. You learn something, you're trying to work it out, and you want to bring it to a hospital. And what you need in that case, finding mentors, just 1 or 2 that you lean into, who are high up at a health system that you want to break into or a health plan, and they are deeply advocating for you, is a way to get warm introductions to individuals who can actually make change, as compared to you just constantly trying to break into a space that you don't have that warm invite. So I would say finding 1 or 2 supporters and mentors. Don't overdo it. You don't need dozens, but really building relationships, 2 strong bridges with individuals who will force you in to an area that you want to innovate on, like a hospital. So that is a way that I found the inertia can be overcome with a little bit faster of a pace, for sure. And then from there, it's healthcare, because of its complexity, will provide you opinions that vary all over the place. So if you have a product and you talk to one specialty of doctors or one hospital system, you might get the most positive feedback saying it's terrific. And then you go to another health system and you find that they run things in an entirely new way or a different way. They hate your product. It's never going to be adopted. So get rapid feedback as soon as possible. Keep your end user in mind, and never think a conversation is like too short or not important. Every single one matters, because I have gotten polar opposite advice from doctors in 2 different health systems or 2 different specialties on things saying this is helpful, or I would never use this in my entire life. So keep getting feedback, talking to people, and record all of it, because eventually you'll find kind of that average that might tell you it's valuable, or average may tell you it's not.
That's very interesting. Obviously, not every startup is going to be successful, and not every idea is a good one. But most often than not, more often than not, the founders tend to be really passionate about their idea, and that they can be blinded by that passion. When one should consider giving up on the idea, or just like pivoting in a different direction?
So as far as context for the previous 2 startups, both actually eventually kind of wound down, largely because cornerstone founders, being that first doctor and the chief resident, kind of got busy, got job opportunities that pulled them away from the startup. So we had to discuss exactly this, like, do we wind down? What do we do next? So I think that closing down a startup or ending things is a deeply personal decision. I would say, shouldn't be made just out of the opinions or the thoughts of your investors or your customers. It should be first your decision over what you want to do.
Mhm.
The question kind of, I would say it's like a tiered system. First, it's, do you want to keep going? If you don't, there's nothing to be done, right? If you don't have that passion for it anymore, it's simple. But let's say I absolutely do want to keep working on it. We're just not cash flow positive. Our runway is, drawn down. We're running out of space. What do we do? Then you go, is there a pivot that you have in mind that could perhaps bring in, whether it's cash is the issue or more interest or whatever? Let's say you say yes, that's terrific. If you don't, that's a problem as well, but let's kind of continue on. Then it comes, if you pivot the company in that direction that can bring in more revenue, are you excited about leading that company in that current form? Because there are easy outs. There might be easy outs that could rapidly generate some revenue in a direction that you absolutely hate. You might be willing to do that, or you might not and say that I would absolutely lose my passion. It's not going to work. And so I think if you know that either you're not passionate about this anymore, you're done. That's easy. If you know that you don't have a pivot strategy, then you're done. And if you get through the first two and you get to the third and say, even if I pivot, I'm not going to want to lead this, then I think there really isn't much else to do but wrap up and move on to your next idea.
I see. Um, that's really interesting. So when in the early stages, the most important thing besides the idea is the team, right? The co-founders, the people behind it, and but if you're especially building in this space, you might not have like a technical background. And
Yep.
as you previously mentioned, you did the biomedical engineering degree just to increase your technical knowledge. So if you come up with a good idea, how should you approach like building that product? When should you consider like applying for this intellectual property stuff, to protect your idea? How you should, how you should find a technical co-founder if you lack technical experience, how you should like focus on R&D and the investors, like how you should really start from the get-go, from the zero.
Sure. So at its earliest stage, so that you don't waste time, I think
Mhm.
to achieve product market fit, you're going to want to, like I mentioned earlier, talk to as many people as possible with specifically with very different characteristics. So not repeating the same profile of, let's say, neurosurgeons that you're talking to, all giving you positive feedback on what you're developing for their next surgery. You need to expand outside of the same health system, expand outside of specialties, health plans, and then only then do you know that product market fit is a possibility if the average of that feedback is relatively positive. From there, let's say you don't have a technical founder, which I've been in that position, and looking forward, I will also be in that position. I want to keep developing that. I would say the using finding creative communities and networks is actually I say a very fun process. There is the classic of like, let's cold email people you find online. That's, I would say, a little bit boring. But the more research I do, I find that the world of Twitter and LinkedIn is a great place that people are writing copious amounts of content. You can find founders or people interested in joining your community pretty quickly if you put out your opinions and your interests on the platforms. One of my friends from Yale, actually, he's building a consumer tech platform, posted last month that he wanted to create, build a team of about 6 founding engineers and executives of sorts, or individuals with experience. And last I checked, I think yesterday, he had his last interview to fill the last position. So just from tweeting about it, he has found his co-founders, because he is not a technical guy. He's more of a marketing business guy. So social media has its value for sure if you use it properly. That's what I would say. From there, you have other fun and exciting things. If you're in an urban location, you can find communities rather quickly. As I'm getting ready myself to move to New York City for medical school, I found just in a couple online searches a run club that is just founders and investors who run together on Saturday talking about their ideas. There's another group that watches Formula One races every week, talking about their ideas for what they're creating. So get creative and join as many communities as you're comfortable with. Use, in addition to that, use the online world, write your opinions online and see who bites and see who you can find. I really think that there are just much more exciting ways than cold emailing a ton of people and hoping something works. And then if push comes to shove and really you're running up against a bit of difficulty there, using your internal network, it can be much more productive than you would think. I think people tend to look at like my university, my alumni base, and like that's all I have. You could look at like if you're part of any scholarships, any camps previously, people who you'd be amazed how willing people are to help you connect you with somebody else, even if you've only run into them once or twice in your life. So leaning deeply into your inner network, I think can be very productive.
when you said hiring, right? Technically, your friend was hiring technical co-founders, right? Or like the employees. Not coming from a technical background, just obviously you have to focus on the person. You kind of utilize your own intuition too. What's your approach to like hiring when you're formulating the core team? If you, I mean, I'm not sure if you have experience in that space or not, but just want to get your opinion on that too.
Yeah. So again, full transparency, I have never hired like with a salary offer of any sort. I
Mm,
have through college and school built teams and selected people
mm,
absent of the
mm,
salary at the
mm,
early stages saying
mm,
which engineer or which whoever is going to be most productive for us.
mm,
So healthcare is very specific. It
mm,
is an arduous process with tremendous regulation and hoops to jump through. I found that in selecting, in this case, like technical, leads, technical founders, people have a lot of excitement over things, or they expect healthcare to be as exciting and fast as consumer tech, fintech, whatever you want, right? That is not the case. So I previously and will continue to really lean into and question an individual's excitement and understanding of healthcare specifically so that they don't get 6 months into a position and realize this is much more arduous with a lot more layers than I could have ever imagined. Consumer tech is where I want to be instead. So, grilling somebody respectfully about healthcare, I think, is super valuable. So, you don't have somebody become dispassionate over time when they realize they're just not as motivated about this as they thought they were, which is fair but unfortunate when it happens months later.
mm. I see. One thing I'm really curious about, because I don't really have a lot of information on that. When you're trying to find people or hire people, you have to kind of pitch the idea, like what you're trying to build, right? At what point you should apply for like IP, intellectual property to protect your idea?
That's okay. Good question. Having I've not done it myself previously. The companies that we developed were all in relatively early stages, but through Columbia and whatnot, I would say the point at which you have hesitancy bringing your idea to investors or others to pitch because you think it is so developed that they can latch onto just a few of your words and realize what you're doing. If it's an early stage and you're saying, I want to improve the supply rooms of hospitals, that is nothing to be concerned about. If you get to a point where you say, we're deploying an Internet of Things network to make sure that app is associated with a certain light system that then is billed through this platform to patients, that network that you have created, you're concerned about somebody locking onto a certain part of those words and mimicking that network, I think you should look into certain levels of protection. I wouldn't claim to be any expert in this, but I think that is the point I would and have found myself considering that level of protection because even just short conversations are concerning to us that somebody could take something so novel and quickly adapt it to their own needs.
So when your idea becomes more specific and refined, then when you should like be more concerned about that. Got it. We already touched upon that, and you mentioned why you're heading to med school. But let's say there's one person who is interested in this med tech, health tech, that space. Um, how they should approach but and they're not sure how to move forward, right? They're saying maybe I should pursue a PhD, maybe I should pursue MD, or maybe I should just become an entrepreneur or like do the business side of things. How do you, like navigate that choice when you're like not sure how to move forward?
So, in making a decision on whether like to pursue degrees or what you want to do to get to the final position, you should do a thought experiment and look long term. Place yourself in the successful founder role. Ideally, you're 15, 20 years ahead. You're in a role with your co founder, your team. What do you think is your ideal life? And this is what I do quite often. I could go from undergrad right to entrepreneurship. If all works out well, I am the individual who has not gone to med school, not taken the medical knowledge, but rapidly learned a variety of different things and sits at the top of the company, not having necessarily expertise in one area of medicine or business or finance, but is kind of a jack of all trades to push it forward. I found that for me, the most exciting role I could possibly have was to be the patient advocate and the medical mind at the top of the company. We'll talk about this a bit later, but I find that there's nothing more exciting than healthcare and health specifically. So when I looked ahead 2 decades, I wanted to be the individual that people turn to and that I led with the patient in mind and health as the focus. And I'm happy to let my co-founder do the finance, let's say, or, the business end of things. Business is still a passion of mine, but not nearly to the extent of the purest of health, which is what pushed me into medicine. If you find that, no, I prefer to be more economics focused, I prefer to be totally technical, then that 20-year thought experiment, I think, will give you clarity on what do I want to be then. Now backtrack from there and choose either your degree or your path based on what you want to achieve in the end. So I think for a moment, look a little long term and then work back from there.
I see. Let's elaborate what you just said. You said you really like the patient advocacy part, right? Like if you're in a company like that, what would your role entail? What position would that be?
So naturally, when you get a medical doctor, or you come out of med school, companies can hire you as the CMO, so the chief medical officer. I personally, in addition to the medical passion that I have, I love the leadership of small, efficient teams. The startup world of Yale was the most exciting thing because I could look at just 4 or 5 of the most intelligent individuals I knew, and we can instruct them on what we're going to do next, build out the week's plan, and everybody get excited together based on my leadership. So ideally, in the co-founding role, it is at the CEO level. That's always been the plan. I don't intend to be the CMO, just because I think that's always a physician hired onto a company that's already been built, whereas I prefer to build my own. So the CEO role is that for me, and that is my long-term plan for sure.
That's really cool. So let's get to your LinkedIn series. You've been covering for 30 days various medtech, digital health tech startups. I've read about a couple of them, really cool companies. What's your approach to research when you research startups? How do you evaluate the ideas? Which ones are how do you distinguish the ones that are appealing to you from the ones that you're not that interested in? What metrics or products really excite you?
So to start with the research, so your first part of your question, I rather simply looked at kind of 2 areas. One, I found the most exciting venture capital firms that I've followed for a while and looked at what are the things they have already invested in. For example, Y Combinator, one of the most classic earliest stage supporting incubators in the country, in California. I can read through their entire health tech page, which I have multiple times, go to the respective websites and just choose based on what gets me the most excited. In addition to that, I perhaps with bias, look at Yale, Columbia, and soon Cornell's ecosystems and see what co-founders associated with those schools have built some really cool stuff. That's more just, it's a passion of mine. I love my school. I want to support that kind of innovation. But the most classic thing I do is look at the exciting VCs and see what they have invested in and move from there to find the cool companies. I could pause there unless you want me to jump into what's the
any VCs that really you like, you appreciate the VCs that you're excited about?
So I mentioned Y Combinator. That's very general.
Yeah.
All early stage startups are up and optional. So within health tech, there is more. So I aligned with OrbiMed is a great one. F Prime, another great one. Polaris, Canon. I remember at Yale we had a partner from Canon come and speak to us, and that I have been focusing on tracking their work for quite some time now. And then Khosla Ventures as well is another one that's big in health tech. So all of those I've been following. But there's other smaller ones. Artist Ventures is a smaller one that I'm really excited about. So those are just, I guess, 5 that come to mind.
Got it. And when you do your research, right? Like how do you evaluate ideas? Like which ones, besides like looking at the ecosystems and the startups, when you look at one idea and then you look at another idea, how do you this one is actually what I'm excited about and it's what I want to write about and this I think has the potential?
Sure. So before I began writing, I set up a dashboard in my Notion Notes app, and essentially chose some filters and criteria that I thought were valuable for the variety of companies that I was choosing. For example, I knew that I wasn't going to write 30 hardware company posts. That would be boring, a little too focused. I wanted to make sure I touched on hardware, on software, on therapeutics. I even touched on administrative work, things that the patient doesn't see, but the hospital or the provider is benefited by. Those topics I needed to touch. So if I remember off the top of my head, I think it was 5 or 6 categories of companies that I had to vary between so that I can provide a nice list with diversity for the 30 in the end. From there, I wanted to make sure they had at least some financial backing. I had been actually messaged a couple of times by different founders who were at an early stage, which is super exciting, and I will support them in the future. But it was so early that it was a back of a napkin concept. And I wanted to instead filter a bit by at least getting a pre-seed together, whether it's Y Combinator or somebody else, to get some validation that this product is moving in the right direction before I post it online. And doctors will go into it and they'll message me about it, and I don't want that to be the earliest thing that they can't even look into because there's not a website, let's say. So that was just another filter, was getting some backing from investors, as well as making sure they're diverse enough in their focused area for healthcare so that my readers weren't going to be reading the same exact concept of a company over and over again.
You're a very impressive person, really. I genuinely wish nothing but the best of luck to you. And I'm sure whatever company you start is going to be very successful. We are at the end of our episode, and it's been a very informative. I think I will watch it again just to really fully grasp everything you said. And, what advice would you give to young, aspiring entrepreneurs, especially those looking to enter the health tech space based on your experiences and insights?
So healthcare is the most disruptable market by far. It is also the most regulated market by far. We look at it as like a $4 trillion behemoth. I would say it's a bit more of like 1,000 $4 billion markets. It's smaller and more broken up because what you're facing is a market that has such inertia and such legal regulation, it's tough to move. So what you're going to come up against is a difficult path, and you have to be ready for it. The way I go about it, and I recommend others, recognize that in life, there is nothing more important than health. No matter what you want to do in life, if you value most importantly the relationships with others, your memories, if you want to do anything in the world, you have to be relatively healthy enough to achieve that. So by extension, there is nothing more noble and exciting to dedicate your life to than the improvement of health and longevity of others. So at your deepest and most dark places of difficulty trying to innovate in healthcare, know that you are doing, in my opinion, the most noble possible thing to improve the health of others. And no matter what others tell you, know that there is room for almost all of us in this space to innovate and capture some market share. You just have to continuously grind through, and you'll get there, even though there will be tremendous amounts of hurdles along the way. I'm confident all of us can do it.
Andrew, thank you so much. I genuinely really appreciate this episode. I hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It means a lot. And looking forward to staying in contact.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.